Hello, everyone. Welcome to AEI. My name's Colin Dueck. I'm a senior fellow here. And today's topic is the federal election in Canada just a few days ago and what it means for the United States. As you know, Prime Minister Carney just met with President Trump yesterday, which was a beautiful coincidence for the point of view of our panel. I'm very fortunate to today have a number of visitors who flew down from Canada, as well as some experts on the subject based here in DC. I'll just go in alphabetical order by last name. Balkan Devlen, to my right, is the founder and co-principal of Pendulum Geopolitical Advisory Group. Jonathan Berkshire Miller is senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Henry Olsen is senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. Tim Powers is chairman of Summa Strategies. Jamie Tronnes is executive director of the Center for North American Prosperity and Security. So what I'm going to do is first begin by asking our Canadian guests to start by analyzing the election results. We're interested in discussing why the Liberals won. I think beyond just the kind of one-sentence version, do a bit of a deep dive into that, this amazing comeback over the last few months. We're going to try to get a sense of whether the Conservatives are really in bad shape or just in moderately bad shape. And of course, the NDP and the Bloc are also worth discussing. We want to hear more about Prime Minister Carney. What do we know about his policy beliefs, his leadership style? And we want to talk about implications for US-Canada relations in some detail. Obviously trade and tariffs, but also defense issues, China, the Arctic. I hope we can talk about short-term as well as long-term. And then finally, we're going to have Henry Olsen to bat cleanup, even though he's going technically, I think, fifth as opposed to fourth, which is he'll address the American side of all this. What does the Trump administration make of it? How's the president likely to respond? How do American conservatives and Republicans view the outcome insofar as they are thinking about it? And what are the prospects for a deal from the American side? So that's it from me for now. And now we're going to hear from our panelists. And we're going to start with, I believe, Tim Powers.
Thank you. Great to be here. First of all, we are not here to take over. I know you want us, but we had enough of you in 1812. I'm teasing. It's delightful to... No, it's delightful to be here the day after our Canadian Prime Minister has been here. At a time when the conversation that dominates Canada, as I'm sure it dominates America, is Donald Trump. I come from the very far east coast of Canada, Newfoundland and Labrador. In the 1940s, we actually flirted with joining the United States. We proposed having an economic union with the United States, and there was a referendum at the time. I don't know if Mr. Trump knows this. He almost got us, and we have better oil than Alberta does, by the way. And at that time, our reason for considering the United States was all about the resources and the opportunity you could provide us, which is sort of ironic at the moment because Canada is of interest to Mr. Trump because of what we can provide to America and do provide to America. What I was going to say is I've been home to Newfoundland and Labrador a lot, and as Jamie and John know, we're very political people, but usually the conversation is local. It's fish prices because we're a big fish exporting province, or oil prices. It's hockey because we love our hockey. But all I have heard since Mr. Trump has been reelected is about Mr. Trump, tariffs, and the economic anxiety that the average person feels. It is more pronounced in Canada than anything I've seen in my lifetime, the perception that Mr. Trump's talk of tariffs and his desires, whatever they actually may be for Canada, are making Canadians worried. And as somebody of the former Premier of Quebec said of Mark Carney, our new Canadian Prime Minister, he became the luckiest person ever to enter the political arena because he had the right resume at the right time for the right crisis, or more appropriately said for the fellows and academics. I'm not a fellow, I'm a former bouncer from George Street, so I'm very honored to be with all these fellows. But I do know a little bit of history, and Henry probably knows well Donald Crichton, the Canadian historian. And one of Crichton's great takes on what shapes events. He says history is a thing of character and circumstance. Mark Carney was the right character in the right circumstance at the moment for Canada. Thus, the luck, I'm not taking anything away from Prime Minister Carney, because I think he has positioned himself effectively very well as a sort of neophyte of politics, but no neophyte of politics on the day he assumes the leadership of the Liberal Party, with Justin Trudeau sitting right in front of him, announces he's cancelling Justin Trudeau's signature policy on carbon pricing. The Canadian election, in the end, did come down to the opportunity older Canadians, 55 plus, women and others, saw in Mr. Carney in addressing their anxieties, I would suggest to you. And it wasn't just older voters, but by and large, the Liberals did something they haven't done in a very, very, very long time. When Jamie and I were involved in Conservative politics, you could always count on the so-called senior voter to be yours. They all went to Mark Carney. They all went because they were, in large measure, very concerned about the economy and who was able to lead it, and they didn't see that Mr. Poilievre yet had those particular abilities. And female voters were never, in many cohorts, not to put in one homogenous group, but never found comfort with Pierre Poilievre. I'll just say a couple more things because we can get into more of it in the questions and answers. Pierre Poilievre, yes, ran for the Conservatives, a historic campaign. Popular vote number better than Stephen Harper in 2011, on par with Brian Mulroney in the Great Free Trade election of 1988. Seat total also better than Stephen Harper had done when he won his majority. I believe that's correct, yeah. Good, Jamie's my fact checker here, it's good. But guess what? And this is probably something we can debate. And Jamie knows this well too, because she was around at the time, though she's still very young. I make that point, noting this is 21 years ago, but when the Conservative Party was built, it wasn't built for second place finishes. It wasn't built just to say, oh, that silver medal's awful shiny, that looks nice around your neck. It was built about winning gold medals. So yes, I won't get too far into this. Pierre Poilievre is safe for now, and he had some successes, but there are real changes and challenges that he needs to address. I will close with this as it relates to the Conservatives and linked to the broader topic here. Really dangerous to make assumptions. Again, you know what they say about assumptions. They make an ass of you and they make an ass of me. The Conservatives made an assumption that the plan they had laid out to defeat Justin Trudeau would work because Justin Trudeau would stay. Common assumption that's floating around right now is that, oh well, the Liberals, the Liberals can't win a fifth term. That can't happen. No one's ever seen that happen. So let's not worry. Let's continue to move forward. I would just say this. I said I was going to close, but look, this time, normally I'd be hosting a 1-hour radio show. So do you mind, Colin? I'm going to go for no. I'm teasing you. I will just say this about Mark Carney. I've had the opportunity to get to know him a little bit through sports, actually, and through other things, and we have some friends in common. I would say, looking at Mark Carney, he reminds me a lot in his governance style of Stephen Harper. I think he will try and govern, much like Stephen Harper did with his early minorities. The last thing I would say, which for me as a Canadian, regardless of my past political affiliation, I don't think he feels encumbered by party politics. I think he wants to seize this moment of crisis, as we're defining it in Canada, and use it for transformation. And I think as you are seeing, or as we are seeing in Canada, he's going to run as hard as he can till he can't run anymore. And he will be, I don't even think, as most politicians do, he's thinking about a second term. He's thinking about what he can do now. So I'll shut up and I'll cede the airways to the rest of the audience.
That was great. Thank you, Tim. By the way, just as an aside, I have never met a newfie I did not like.
Well, I'll ruin that for you today. I'm sure.
Okay, Jamie, you're next.
Yeah, so I'm from Alberta, so probably some of you have heard a few things about Alberta in the past few weeks. Because Alberta traditionally votes Conservative, there's a strong sense of Western alienation that I think different parts of America can relate to, in that you vote kind of in opposition to the federal government, and they feel very much in Alberta like their voice has not been heard. And Premier of Alberta right now, Danielle Smith, has made it easier for Alberta to put forward a referendum on separation from Canada as a consequence of what she sees of Eastern Canada not being able to recognize Alberta's priorities and a sense of Western alienation. Whether or not this is going to succeed, I will park that for future times because I think the polls are not with her right now. But I will say that this is another sort of factor of the election, is that there has been a lot of regional differences in Canada. And for the first time, we had a very different regional kind of election where the Conservatives actually got a lot more representation outside of their base than people had expected them to get. But also some of the traditional Quebec separation party vote went Liberal for an unusual reason, and that was that they felt that a viable nation of Quebec cannot happen without Canada being able to stand up as a whole to the annexation talk from the United States, and that if Quebec can't separate now, there's no chance of them being able to separate if Canada becomes part of the United States. And also that there was these feelings of the French language, the French culture being threatened by the talk of annexation. And so it really moved the vote count in Quebec, probably like nothing I've seen in a long time, for separatists to actually vote for the Party of National Unity, which may sound completely unheard of, and that is because it is. Whereas on the other side of the country, you have people who have traditionally voted conservative, not just out of a sense of political ideology, but a little bit out of a sense of ties to what was formerly the Reform Party, the party that championed Western alienation as an issue, which then got folded into the Conservative Party, as Tim mentioned, which is not around to get silver medals. It was formed from all these parties that were sort of in opposition to, who wanted to then become the governing party, as opposed to just traditional opposition parties. And so that is having a big play in that one part of the country feels for the first time that they need to be part of the country, and the other part of the country is starting to seriously think about what is our place in this country. But I do need to put a caveat on that for the American audience, is to say that this is not a referendum to join the United States, and it will not be a referendum to join the United States. If Alberta is looking at the question of separation, the most viable question will be for Alberta to become its own sovereign country. But again, I think we're months, maybe years until that question comes home. But one other thing that was very interesting in this election as well is that the far left party, the New Democratic Party, the NDP, really had their vote collapse. The leader of the party lost his seat. The co-leader of the Green Party also lost his seat, and both of them have resigned as because of that. And so it really showed that Canadians weren't looking to have a protest vote. They wanted their vote to count, and they really felt that the stakes were high enough that they needed to overlook their own individual ideology or political leanings in order to make the strongest statement that they could. And that was necessarily about the question of who is best to lead us through this crisis. One other final thing is that Pierre Poilievre's campaign really did talk a lot about the Canadian dream and the cost of living. And part of the reason why there was this demographic split, Pierre's campaign mantra was repeated so often that most Canadians could probably tell you in their sleep that you should live in a nice house on a safe street.
Stop the crime, axe the tax.
Yeah.
Build the homes.
Build the homes under a proud flag. That was, yes. So if you already have a house and it's been paid off for years, you're not really worried about living the Canadian dream. You've already lived it by the time you're probably in your 50s and 60s. So you're not worried. That's not your primary crisis. But we did see a lot of folks who were at the younger end of the Canadian spectrum who really felt like the Canadian dream is out of their reach. And that is a demographic problem for a lot of Canadians. And I think Mark Carney moved very quickly to try and recognize that. He talked about it in his victory speech as well, that he had recognized that this is an issue. And so, it goes to Tim's point that the government really does understand the coalition of Canadians and what the issues are. And I believe, Prime Minister Carney's in it to try and stay in it for a long time.
Great, thanks, Jamie. So remind me, who's next, Jonathan or Balkan?
I'll go.
Jonathan.
I'll jump into the lion's den next. Well, thank you so much. And how fascinating and how great to have a panel here talking about the Canadian election with no one from Quebec and Ontario.
We call that a good day.
So we love our people from Quebec and Ontario, but I'm from Nova Scotia originally, so I think it's interesting to have these different sort of perspectives. So I'm going to come in a little bit, Colin, on the sort of foreign policy security lens here on the election. And I think as somebody who's followed this for a number of years, I found it fascinating. Usually a lot of Canadians would just sleep through the election. They'd sleep before, they'd sleep during, maybe they'd sleep after the election. This was a really important one. You could tell for a lot of Canadians, whether it was the amount of people that got out to vote, the amount of interest, and actually on the foreign and security issues. And you could argue maybe the reasoning was not the reasoning that we hoped for 6 months or 1 year ago, but the fact that there was actually discussion and debate on national security, defense, foreign affairs was something in the right direction. So I think that is a silver lining that we can touch on to, is the fact that national defense spending, for example, came up in some of the discussions. The candidates from both sides really started paying some attention to this. I think the challenge that we're going to have to face here is to make sure that we channel this in the right direction, though. So it's one thing to have a constructive debate on this, to bring topics up, but the second part of that is following through with the capabilities that are needed. So this is one of the things that I'm really focused on now, is I agree that Mark Carney did a very good job at seizing the opportunity in the moment that was here. But Canada is facing a raft of different challenges that many US allies are facing as well. We do have a contentious time right now in the relationship with North America. I'm not going to deny that. I won't invoke 1812. One of the things that I often say when I'm talking to a US audience is I always thank them for purchasing Alaska from the Russians. There may be a few Canadians who are thinking, well, I don't know about that now. I'm still grateful that you have Alaska. So I'd much rather have you on our border than Russia. But taking the US-Canada relationship to a side right now, there are other challenges, whether it's a revisionist Russia, whether it's the strategic competition from China that we need to face and we need to build those capabilities for. So I think the important thing is to get beyond this moment in time right now where we're hyperventilating about national security and defense, and we actually channel that into the real capabilities that we need to be investing in. So I think this is sort of the long-term lens that I'm really paying attention to, is seeing whether it's institutionally, of course, government is part of it, but it's also empowering our industry and innovation. And I think this is a big thing from the Canadian side that we haven't necessarily done as much of a good job in recent years, is having a full Team Canada approach when it comes to national security and defense. And the last thing that I'll mention here too, and there's two important summits that are coming up. One, of course, we hope it's a very successful summit, which is the G7 summit, which is being hosted in Canada. The second key international summit will be the NATO summit, which is hosted in The Hague in Europe. And making sure, number one, that these summits go successful, we have to think about what is the sort of the long-range threat forecast. So those who are focused on national security defense often think about the percentages of GDP, for example, 2%, which we've committed to for several years and have not yet attained, although we promise we're getting there. I think we need to have a much more long-range forecast about thinking about what are the capabilities we're going to need well beyond percentages of GDP. And that's whether that's protecting our Arctic, of course, which is a frontline national security discussion for Canada, whether that's doing more in the Indo-Pacific, and now Canada has an Indo-Pacific strategy and is very focused on that part of the world, or whether it's doing more in the transatlantic space. As a founding member of NATO, obviously we have a key mission in Latvia to protect some of our friends in the Baltics. So I think we need to be thinking about where we position those resources. So that's kind of, Colin, I guess the election's interesting. I'm happy foreign and security policy was referenced in it. But the so what factor is, how are we going to, number one, get those capabilities that will help us match the rhetoric with reality? And can we sustain this discussion? So can we, the discussion on foreign and security policy should not be because of a few tweets or things that were said about the Canada-US relationship. It should be about what's happening in the world, what's, international institutions fracturing, geopolitical rivals on the march, challenges to many of our allies internationally. This is where the focal point should be. And I'm hoping that we seize this moment to sort of reform many of our institutions and our capabilities towards that.
Great, thanks, Jonathan. Balkan.
Thank you very much. I mean, it's hard to follow after three great speeches. Maybe a couple words about the election itself, and just to follow up on a couple of things Jamie pointed out, and then get to the security foreign policy side of things. On the election, just want to maybe highlight one thing, and that is what happened in Canada also is a reflection of the sort of realignment within the broader Western democracies when it comes to voter coalitions, in the sense that conservatives, in a way, become the party of the young, the working class, increasingly immigrant and newcomers to the societies. In other words, the ones who are striving to have things and don't have it, versus the Liberal Party end up being more on the ones that have things. So I'm worried about protecting that. So the ironically, in a way, the messaging also throughout the election was on the conservative side was about the Canadian dream and the sort of more hopeful message, versus on the Liberal side it was more about the fear of that Donald Trump and the trade and so on and so forth. One interesting tidbit there, though, is when you look at the way that the votes go, there was actually a quite interesting analysis of the results. The ridings, the districts, electoral districts, that are most trade exposed to the United States, the Conservatives have a 6-point advantage in those ridings, the ones who are most exposed to the trade tariffs and retaliation, versus the urban and the 55 plus communities, which are not necessarily exposed as much as those other ridings did go to the Liberals. And of course the Quebec separatist vote. Jokingly, I said to a colleague right after the election that the separatists probably thought about that they need to have a country to be able to separate from, and therefore went for the Liberals. But this also suggests that the new Liberal coalition is not necessarily a very stable one compared to the coalition that Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives built. Right? It's generally referred to, and there are people who study these closer than I am, but it was generally said that the Conservatives have a low ceiling and a high floor when it comes to voting, and in this election they push the ceiling as much as they can. We'll see whether the unique circumstances of this particular election will be repeated in the second one. But the Conservative, this coalition, the base looks more stable to me than the Liberal one. In that sense, Mark Carney was, I think, in the right place in the right time, and a lot of people see in him what the Italians see in Mario Draghi, for example, at the time. And we'll see whether the result will be the same or not. And I'm hopeful in a way, because the meeting yesterday, and this is maybe a way to talk about the foreign and security policy part of it, would help to sort of reduce the tension, the heat in the relationship. I mean, no news is good news in this first meeting, and I think it went well as much as it can be expected to. In that sense, we can hopefully go back to start having a long-term conversation about where this relationship go. There's a phrase in Ottawa that you will hear often, that the Americans are our best friends, whether we like it or not. And that is gonna remain the same. Geography may not be destiny, but it's 80% of destiny. And from economic to foreign and security relationship, this is going to be and will be the most important relationship for Canada going forward. Yes, you can play on the margins a little bit here and there and diversify economically, security-wise, etc., but it does not change the fundamental dynamic. So Hopefully the new slogan will be, rather than elbows up, it will be, keep calm and carry on, and develop that relationship, because it is beyond the administrations and the governments. It is about the national interest. On the very briefly on the foreign and security side, Jonathan did mention quite a bit of what I was also planning to talk. I would say two things. When you look actually the platforms as well as sort of the attitudes and the speeches by different parties, there's a very narrow band when it comes to talking about what the Canadian national interest is, how Canada need to be positioned in the world, because the national interest is roughly quite determined. It's about maintaining good relationship with the United States, protecting Canada, protecting the Arctic, the continental defense, being involved with the allies in Europe and Asia. That you can have a little bit differences in emphasis here and there, but broadly those are the interests. Canada is a trading nation. We need a stable international system to be able to protect our prosperity and be able to contribute to the defense of that system and our allies, so that we have and continue to earn our seat at the table. So those are relatively stable national interests. So I think that would continue to do so. We will probably see. I think this is where we need to sort of pay attention to the keep calm and carry on component when it comes to developing relationships, including security and defense relationships, with our other allies, including Europe and in the Pacific, which I think is important. But we should also be very realistic about the possibility of those relationships, supplanting the United States, which is not going to happen, right? Europeans themselves are heavily reliant on the U.S. on the defense side. The metal you can produce, but the high-end capabilities, everyone is extremely dependent. We are also extremely dependent on the U.S. Our defense industry, 65% produces for the United States, et cetera, et cetera. So yes, we can have marginal on the margins, but I think we should also be tempered down the expectations of, Europeans are coming up with 850 billion euros, which they are not coming up with 850 billion euros. That is fiscal space if they want to spend, et cetera. And maybe we can take part there. Maybe we could. There's some partnerships in the Indo-Pacific, and we need to rely on them, as Americans seem to be at least partially focusing on the Western Hemisphere and reducing their forward presence. And Canada can, on specific components, can step up and defend the allies. But we also have to be very, very clear that we are in North America, we will remain in North America, and our primary and most important relationship is going to be with the United States.
Great point. Henry.
Thank you for including me. From the American standpoint, what I would say is that President Trump's behavior and words during yesterday's Oval Office photo session tell you what you need to know. That he's didn't really care who won the election, because he viewed them as essentially similar prospects. That Poilievre had, rightfully for Canadian politics, tried to distance himself from the Trumpist elements within the Conservative coalition, which of course for a man like Donald Trump meant that he was insufficiently deferential. I was always a little surprised, although given the existence of the People's Party, not too surprised that Poilievre didn't try to make more of Trump's statements before the election that he actually preferred dealing with Carney than Poilievre. But the more you wanted to lean into that, the more you might have driven some of your real hard Trumpists over to the protest party on the right, so he decided not to take that risk. But what that meant is that from the White House, it was 6 of one and half a dozen of the other. They can deal with either person. So what is it that Trump wants? He made that crystal clear, as he has made it clear to virtually every nation in the world, as he's been saying for decades. He doesn't believe in trade deficits. He does not believe that the United States should be running trade deficits with major countries. And he has dramatically overstated the amount of the combined trade deficit, but I looked it up before I came here, including services, it's about $50 billion US a year. So let's take that rather than the $200 billion figure. the thing that will get Donald Trump interested is if you can come to an agreement that will essentially eliminate that as rapidly as possible. That will be extremely difficult for Prime Minister Carney to do. Why is that? Well, let's take a look at the 4 quickest ways I can see to do that, and that is purchasing more in defense, paying more for drugs, buying more American agriculture, and allowing more American entertainment into the country. That each one of those creates huge problems. That there's a reason Canada not only hasn't spent 2% of GDP on defense, has been one of the biggest underperformers, even under Prime Minister Harper. It's because Canadians don't want to spend money on defense. But the problem there is not just a geopolitical threat to Canada and the problem of the melting of the Arctic, but that it used to be that Canada could be in line with most of the European allies. But you've got the NATO summit, since Vance's Munich speech, Belgium, another one of the worst performers versus the 2% target, has said they will meet it this year. The conservative-led government has moved up plans that had originally been to get to 2% by 2029 to say we will meet it this year. Why? Because they want to go to Brussels in July and be able to tell the president we're doing our minimum. Spain, a socialist government that hasn't contributed virtually anything to Ukraine, has said it will meet 2% this year. It is utterly laughable to think that the Canadian government can get away with not coming close to or meeting that within the same time frame when tiny Belgium and socialist Spain can do it. Well, what does that mean? Well, that means is purchasing a lot of equipment. But Prime Minister Carney has already said that he may not continue the F-35 deal. Wrong. He's already said he wants to diversify Canadian forces equipment purchases away from reliance on the United States. Hello, McFly, is that going to work in the Oval Office? This is the problem, is that what may be in the Canadian interest and be the Canadian voter preference is not conducive to making a deal with Donald Trump. And then let's talk about drugs. Donald Trump has, unlike for a Republican, tried to downplay the role of the pharmaceutical industry and get Americans to be able to buy drugs for less. The flip side of that is I am sure he will expect countries around the world to buy more. That what's been happening is that pharmaceutical innovation has been subsidized by the American consumer by paying more through private insurance and through public insurance, and the rest of the developed world has largely been able to pay lower costs because pharmaceutical companies have been able to share more of their, spread more of that to the Americans. That too is under pressure. Does anyone think the Canadian pharmaceutical, and I know you have different drug plans depending on your, although do you have now a unified drug plan after? Do you have a unified, it's still provincial?
Yes.
Right, so that'll depend on province to province. But Donald Trump is not going to deal with these technicalities. Agriculture, even Stephen Harper tried to protect a large amount of agriculture. And that might be the easiest place for Carney to go to, given how many of the agricultural heavy regions out west are indomitably conservative. Just like Australia, when it became free market in the 80s, the Labor government first deregulated agriculture, which was the basis of the support for the opposition coalition, being able to say, well, we'll hurt the Saskatchewan wheat farmers. And so forth, might be the easiest place to go, but that will still be wrenching. And then you have culture, which is, you've been protecting your, having minimum Canadian content for years. I'm sure Donald Trump will turn to, or have his people at some point turn to say, why is it that Schitt's Creek can come to the United States, but we can't sell as much to the Canadian market? Any one of these would be problematic. All of them will be on the table, plus things I'm sure I have not thought of. And so the question is, does Prime Minister Carney want to pay the price? He probably won't want to at first, and that will be in the short-term benefit. But eventually what that means, given Trump's personality, is that the tariffs will stay, and we haven't even started to talk about the USMCA renegotiation that starts next year. And Trump has said, we want those auto jobs in America. We want those steel and aluminum plants here. The fact is that in 1988, you overcame a century and a half of fear of the United States to basically say we can trust those guys. And Donald Trump has said, no, I'm looking at this in a dollars and cents way. So the question is, how can Prime Minister Carney make a deal that is also saleable in Canada? And I will leave that to you, the Canadians, to answer. But when I look at his coalition, this is a man who had all his, everything lined up for him, and he couldn't win a majority government. What deal is going to get the backing of the NDP members in Parliament? What deal is going to get the backing of the Bloc? It would certainly not be in the Conservative Party's interest to offer a cross-party line, saving line to Prime Minister Carney. So the question is, what deal could get through your Parliament, much less what you negotiate with Donald Trump? Again, I leave that to the people who are from Canada to answer that question. But I think these are difficult questions and difficult things. This is not going to be an easy time. And essentially, much of the world has, since the fall of the Berlin Wall, relied on the American consumer to prop up their economies. And that is through trade integration, but also through the trade surpluses. The Germans have been able to do that. The Canadians, the Mexicans, the Japanese, the Chinese. And what Donald Trump has said, the American consumer is not open for business anymore. We've hollowed out too many of our own communities. We're tired of supporting Brampton and supporting Brantford and Sherbrooke, when in fact, the entire Upper Peninsula of Michigan is a depressed zone. And the way America is set up, you might have support on Capitol Hill, you certainly have support in the intellectual community, but you don't have support in the Oval Office. You're going to have to pay the price in some way. And the question is, can you be willing to pay that price? Can you find alternatives quickly enough? And the Europeans aren't going to be your saviors because they're going through the same problems. The Brazilians are not going to be your saviors. Over a decade or a decade and a half, yes. Not in the 3-year time frame, 2-year time frame. That, I remember reading Stephen Harper's Right Here, Right Now, talking about the 2008, and basically said we had to go into deficit spending in 2008 because the Americans were going to do it, and when the Americans catch a cold, we catch a fever. Well, it's unfortunate, but you're going to have to make some very difficult decisions. And Carney may be the right man, but politics is politics. And unless there's something that can get the NDP or the Bloc on board and keep them on board, and Canadian public opinion doesn't sour on some of the things that's going to have to be done, I think the prospect for a deal in the next 18 months are very low.
Thanks, Henry. That was a refreshingly cool blast of ice cold water. And I want to ask the question of the other four. I mean, how do you respond to Henry's point, which I think is pretty well grounded in the American political reality right now? Whoever would like to take that.
Who goes first?
Why? I'm happy to go first. Henry makes a very good point. I'm depressed now. I'm just going to go back to the hotel and go to sleep. Can't be done. First, I would say on the coalition that Carney has, speaking to the politics, let's see what happens by the time Parliament actually is sitting to determine whether he has a majority or not, because that may help address the political currency he has or doesn't have. I would go where Canadians often go on this argument, and that is to American consumers. You talked about Michigan. Michigan, its leadership, Wisconsin, its leadership, others have echoed strong support of the need to keep what exists now, because I don't know if Americans are like Canadians in this way, that while we may hear the academic arguments and see the closed shops, we still go to places and look for deals and prices and consumer opportunities. And I think there is a realization that, yes, the president is serious about what he is saying about wanting to rebuild America, make America great again, but equally to your point, you're not going to put 5 new auto factories in the United States, reinvigorate an oil industry, and do that all in 2 or 3 years while your political capital slips away. It was a great line that I had Frank McKenna on the radio program I host the other day. And Mr. McKenna is the former Canadian ambassador here in Washington, and he made the point that more people in the United States believe in aliens than do that the tariffs are a good thing. So I think we, to your point, Henry, have to use the political will that exists in America with our American allies to point out that, yes, there are inequities. I think you've outlined them very well, but some of those inequities may exist on a global balance sheet, but in your pocketbook, they're very different things, and your pocketbook is doing well. But I think I'll conclude on this and open it up to my colleagues. I don't think Canadians are underestimating Trump or the Canadian leadership is underestimating Trump or simply waiting for him to leave in 3 years. So I think there are ways we can build back better in terms of the opportunity, but there are those challenges you talk about are real. But I guess, sorry, I always say I'm finished. I'm not finished. Jesus, that's the Newfoundlander in me. On the films, I come from one of the most culturally creative provinces in the country. And I don't hear any American film producers and businesses complaining when they come to our province and they get tax breaks, our dollar's dirt cheap, and they produce global productions that make them a ton of money and I think go back to their shareholders in the United States. So there's different opportunities there, I think, to deal with these things. Now I am really finished.
I agree with Tam that there's going to be an interesting watch party perhaps in Canada around the midterms.
Yeah.
And that's going to probably start right after all the primaries are done. Because we're going to see increasingly, I think starting this Christmas, some big changes in the way that we shop for our families here in the United States, and how Canadians actually might have different access to toys at Christmas than Americans have for the first time. Things are going to be very different in just 6 months' time from now. And I don't pretend to know the future, but I do like to watch the shipping regulations closely, and there are new shipping regulations coming in to effect here in the United States on October 14th, just in time for the holidays, which will punish Chinese-owned ships and percentage of Chinese-made ships when they dock here in the US. Already we're seeing decreased shipping coming from China. That is probably going to affect shipping coming from all over the world starting in October. And so, recently Robert Lighthizer spoke in Canada, and he seemed to think that Canada, under his idea of tariffs, Canada would make out really well because of the USMCA. He felt that the USMCA was part of the plan and that it needed to stay in place. And unfortunately, the person who was interviewing him at the time did not press him on that, because I would have loved to hear more of, is that part of the plan? Has it been part of the plan all along that the United States would still have access to goods coming in from other places through their northern border? Because that sure is interesting. Will we see reverse flows of goods coming from Canada to the US? I don't know. There's a lot of questions that we really just cannot get answers to. And if we as analysts can't get answers to them, how do businesses get answers to them? How can you plan your Christmas time sales, your R&D around your next product, even not just for this Christmas, but for next Christmas or for next summer? What will be the future of super soaker technology? I don't know, but I sure want to find out. And where can I get it? And will it be tariffed at 145%? These are the questions that me as a mom I have. I think there's a lot of questions that consumers have, and those questions are going to be put to the electorate very soon, a lot sooner than Mr. Trump's term will end. And I think we're already seeing the Senate start to recognize that because they have a little bit different political insulation on it. But I think the White House, if they cannot get some quick gains very, very soon and really be seen to demonstrate that on the tariff issue, this is going to be the #1 issue that dominates, because cost of living was the #1 issue that dominated not just the US election, but it was also tied with the #1 issue in the Canada election too. Cost of living is still a hangover from COVID times. People are still really concerned about it. And that is something that is going to definitely be affected by tariffs. It's something that polls are showing people are still extremely concerned about, including Republicans who voted for Trump. And so we really, if the White House can't get some quick wins and show, hundreds of thousands of jobs being made in preparation for the sacrifice of everybody's Christmas time and the latest super soaker technology, then there's going to be some reckonings, I think, and we'll see some political capital being lost for sure as we go forward.
Maybe on this point, just two things to follow up on. One, I think there's one of the reasons why President wanted to push these things in a very quick way through executive orders and not through the Congress is this very limited window of opportunity, and of course the razor thin margins in the House, and that window is rapidly closing. And I think one of the reasons why the sort of the aggressive way of let's get a deal, let's make a deal, let's talk, is the reason that when the effects of those policies are actually started to be felt in late summer to the fall, then the self-preservation instinct of members of Congress will probably kick in. And there's only so much you can be worried about, Elon Musk primarying you when your constituents are throwing, eggs at you because the shelves are not there and empty and jobs are not there.
No one can afford to throw eggs at anyone right now.
Yeah, exactly. So they are not exactly. It's an expensive signal. It's a costly signal, right, of your disapproval. So I think there is a reason why this has been pushed very hard at this stage, because that window is closing, which then again goes back to my point about keep calm and carry on, in the sense that there is no acting on impulse and acting under that pressure. It's a very well-known marketing and sales technique, right? You want to pressure, create time constraints, and make decisions very quickly, because then if you have time to think about it, and the cost of these policies will become quite obvious. I think to me that's one of the things. And the other point is, of course, there's no one. I mean, the president has a way of a disposition, I would say, about how he sees trade and tariffs and so on and so forth. But there are also different factions within the administration that have different ideas about trade, and of course also sequencing those actions, right? It's one thing to go after allies first and then go to China, versus going after China and then try to bring allies together. Is it going to be about deregulation and enabling the innovation to emerge authentically, or is it about manufacturing goods and bringing that back? Dave Chappelle had a nice routine in one of his comedy shows back in 2017 during the first Trump administration. He basically says that, look, I want to wear the Nike, I don't want to make the Nike here, right? So it's also about whether those kind of things that the more protectionist factions within the Trump administration wants, whether those jobs are the ones that American people want, et cetera, et cetera. So I think there's an advantage of playing for time on this for Canada and for other American allies.
Yeah, a couple just points on this. First of all, Jamie, to your point on the tariffs and the implications in Christmas time, we may benefit in Canada, but actually a lot of people are very worried about this, not just in Canada, but in Australia, parts of Europe, is the mass dumping of Chinese products as a result of the tariffs. So there's, our kids may be happy. Thankfully, my kids are beyond the Fisher Price stage, so it'll be different types of goods that maybe are cheap goods from China, but that's actually a real problem as well. is the opening for dumping. But to a couple of your points here, one thing on the national security premium, I 100% agree with you. The room is becoming smaller and smaller, and the group, we all saw that chart, whether 2% allies who didn't match the grade, and the room is becoming smaller and smaller. And the second point on that is that, and you'll see this, I think, in the NATO summit this year in The Hague, is that this discussion of 2%, this is a far, far older discussion. 2% is the absolute cellar, rock bottom basement. We should be talking 3% at minimum. And of course, we've seen newspaper reports that are talking 3.5 and upwards. Right. So, I mean, yes, we don't always have to fixate on the numbers, but the idea of we can get to 2% in 5 years, 9 years, 10 years, I mean, that shouldn't even be a question anymore. That needs to be the absolute now. And the second point, I think, on diversification, I agree. I mean, and to Balkan's point on this too, I mean, geography doesn't define us entirely, but it's a big part of it. We've tried the diversification thing before, and we should be doing more, of course. I think I've been a vocal proponent of us doing more in Asia, doing more with partners in Europe. I just came back from Germany for one of their big business fairs. There's a moment in time right now for us to do more, but we have to be absolutely realistic about how much that can impact us. We absolutely still need the United States in economic and security terms. And my sort of last point on this, as much as we need to hedge into democracies, we need to hedge into friends in Brussels, friends in Japan and South Korea, Taiwan, I think there's opportunities economically. We also have to sort of get ourselves into the mud a little bit and look at some relationships that are going to provoke some questions. And I'm going to just throw a few names out here, but India is a complicated relationship for us. We absolutely have to be finding ways to be doing more economically with India. If we're going to be serious about diversification, you look at follow where the money's going. You see pension funds and others, they are consistently ramping up the investment and interest in places like India. We should be looking at the Middle East as well, different parts of the Middle East too. So the comfortable answer to just say, let's take a flight to Brussels, let's go to Tokyo, and that'll fix all of our problems. I mean, I love both of those places. But the key takeaway is, number one, we need the United States. And if we're talking pure diversification, we're going to have to do a few things that are a little bit uncomfortable for Canadians traditionally.
I think there is some room for optimism, though. I mean, within our geographical sphere, we have two large exports. I mean, Canada is very much an extractives power. And if we can get, say, like a natural gas bullet line from Alberta to Texas, that could be the start of something that slowly brings back our geographical influence here in the US. Natural gas, all the easy-to-get natural gas is about to come to a conclusion in the next decade. The easy, quick shale. And Canada is still going to have a lot of natural gas that it can export. I mean, in Canada, we also measure our energy reserves of oil, natural gas in thousands of years instead of America, which measures it in decades. Our number 2 export, this might shock you, is actually gold. And so gold is a huge commodity right now when things are shaky. People kind of look at gold, and now our gold industry is really taking off. And we can sell that anywhere. You don't need a huge ship. You don't need major tankers. So Canada does have some opportunities to diversify and to strengthen its extractives industry. This might be the crisis-opportunity that we need to move forward and get moving with permitting, get moving with looking at how we can build our ports back up. How can Canada start exporting externally? But also, how can we get our products that we know that our southern neighbors going to need to market, so that we have those conversations, so that when America and Canada are ready to really, as Donald Trump did say, extend the friendship and start counting on each other as allies in a big way, and put all the annexation talk aside, that those ties are still going to be there, and that we can start talking about how we can make them stronger. Because Donald Trump won't be in office forever. The threat against Canada is not permanent. And as a lot of people said here, we're kind of playing the puck for time. And I think that Canadians are willing to suffer for a little bit here if that's what it takes for us to start looking at it. But it also is become sort of a national moment for realizing where our strengths are as an economic superpower, and that they are in energy. Our strengths are in extractives, they're in mining, they're in potash, they're in all of these critical minerals. And Canada has a real opportunity now to get moving on permitting reform, on getting things out of the ground, on building pipelines, whether it's from east to west or north to south. We've got to get something going in Canada so that we can start getting our economy going. And this might just be the kick in the butt that we need.
Very good. I have a couple quick sets of questions for the panel. One on the domestic Canadian side and then another on the international side. So just to sort of follow up on a couple of points that were made about the Canadian election, I'd like to hear, and this is for anybody who wants to tackle it, there's two questions that I have. One is, clearly the NDP, collapsed. This is a storied party in Canada, a Democratic Socialist Party that can typically count on at least a couple dozen seats, 15, 20% of the vote. It just completely melted down. We know there's a tactical reason, which is those voters rallied to Carney and the Liberals in order to oppose Trump. But is there reason to think that this might be more permanent? Is there something going on with the NDP in terms of the base of the party? That's one question. The other is, when I look at suburban Toronto, I saw some really interesting results. You cannot win, it seems to me in Canada, you cannot win without winning suburban Toronto. It's just too big. You've got a lot of Asian Canadian voters. Balkan actually touched on this. There were Tory pickups in some of those suburban seats, but not enough. The Liberals still did very well in suburban Toronto, including in seats that had a lot of working class voters and a lot of Asian Canadian voters. So you made a really interesting point, Balkan, about the way the Tories and the Liberals are kind of trading places. But just on the demographics of it, how does it look moving forward, and what are the strengths and weaknesses of the different parties that we've seen revealed?
I'm sure others have ideas, but maybe one short thing. It might be this may not necessarily be good news or comforting news for conservatives, but it looks. Canada is and the Canadian population is center left, largely, right? And in a system where we move towards a real two-party system or 2.5-party system, if you include the Bloc and Quebec's unique status, a population that is dispositionally center-left would make it extremely hard for conservatives to regularly win. And there's a reason why Liberal Party is generally considered as the natural governing party in Canada. And we kind of see this in this election as well. Conservatives really did push the ceiling and performed very well, but then that was just not enough. The distribution is one part of it, but the other part is the natural disposition. What that means for the future electoral faith of the Conservative Party, we'll see. But that I think is a signal whether NDP survives as a viable party or not, or whether it will be eventually absorbed into the Liberal Party or emerge as some other sort of party that sort of sheds its working class roots and became much more of an urban party. I think that would determine how things would go. But in a sort of a truly two-party system in Canada, I think that would actually does not necessarily work very well for the Conservatives.
On the NDP, it was only in 2011, after Mr. Layton won opposition, because they did look at their silver medal as a gold in that circumstance, that people were talking about the death of the Liberals. So let's look where we are 14 years later. I think the challenge with the NDP was twofold. One, Mr. Singh became the last remnant of the parliamentary pact with Prime Minister Trudeau. And Canadians had so much animus, rightly or wrongly, towards Justin Trudeau, that when he was gone, Mr. Singh didn't represent an opportunity to support, he represented an opportunity to oppose. And I think part of the challenge with the NDP is when Mr. Layton had success, when Mr. Broadbent before him had success, when Mr. Mulcair had a degree of success, they had a voice. Mr. Singh took the vocal cords out of the NDP and made them irrelevant. I think they will look to find a way back to have a voice, and I think they will have a place and a space for that voice. Just building off something Balkan said, it doesn't directly answer your question, Colin, but look, I think that Ontario was fascinating because you had the traditional Toronto wins for the Liberals, but where Pierre did very well, Poilievre did very well, was touching on the crime and the affordability. Neither of those issues is going to go away in the next 3 or 4 years. That still presents, unfortunately, describing it as an opportunity, it is for the Conservatives, but also for Carney. And you saw in his first press conference, in his second sentence, he talked about crime and affordability. I would close with this, and maybe it puts a bow on it, or it confuses you, and whatever. You guys will figure it out, you're smart. Mark Carney is a progressive Conservative. Mark Carney has, let's not forget, Stephen Harper wanted Mark Carney to be his finance minister. Stephen Harper, not Paul Martin, put forward Mark Carney, put Mark Carney into the governorship of the Bank of Canada. Mark Carney, I come from the progressive Conservative part of the Conservative Party. There's still a few of us alive. We don't drag our knuckles, though we look like we could fossilize at any minute. I appreciate that. Many of the people that I know that come from that part of the Conservative Party find comfort in Mark Carney, and that is something Pierre Poilievre is going to have to find a way to address if Mark Carney continues in his long tenure of 1 week as an elected Prime Minister to have success.
Very good, thank you. I mean, one thing that just a final thought on this before we move on to the international side, is the Liberals are just really good at winning federal elections. I mean, if you think about the last 130 years, I mean, they've won like 2/3 of the time. They're one of the winningest national parties in the Western world. There's just no getting it. They just seem to do whatever has to be done to win. And I say that as a conservative.
Conservatives are the idealists.
But if I can offer something on that.
Henry.
The other party that has that title is the British Conservative Party.
Yeah.
And in 2019, they faced a near-death experience after the loss in the European elections. They were running 3rd or 4th in national polls after the Peterborough by-election. And that's when they elected Boris Johnson. And they won their huge majority that looked like the realignment. And look at where they are today.
Yeah.
Where they are, what they decided in government was they didn't want to implement the program that they ran on. And the people who joined them, the former Labour voting red wall, Brexit supporting voters, decided that they couldn't trust these people. They just got annihilated in the local elections. The most recent polls have them between 15 and 20% nationally. The most recent YouGov poll that came out this morning has them down below 30 seats, if modeled. And my point is that Carney is in a very similar situation. He needs to keep people who are traditional Liberal voters, plus people who are willing to give Pierre a chance when Trudeau was the leader, plus half of the old left. You know, so you take a look, where were the polls when he was elected, when Trudeau resigned? You know, it was like a 23-point conservative lead. Where were the polls when Trump took office and Carney became leader? It's still a 20-point lead. What changes? What changes is the left, the NDP, the Bloc, and the Greens go from 30% down to where they ended up, which is around what, 15%, 14%, something like that. That almost, some of that goes, the NDP in the working class areas goes to the Pierre, but a lot of it goes to the Liberals. So he has to keep the people who don't want permitting reform because, oh my God, that means we're extracting natural gas and contributing to climate change, with the old progressive conservatives for whom that's a perfectly reasonable thing. The Conservative Party of Britain is dying because they couldn't face up to the challenge. And I don't think you should underestimate, and that's why I bring it around, is that you know, I don't want to see America and Canada drift apart or all of that stuff, but I know the man in the Oval Office, and he wants a bottom line number. He can talk about all the factions and all the stuff you want. He's going to want to say, when are we going to stop sending tens of billions of dollars a year north? And the idea of, well, we can send more gas through Canada, through Texas. Well, that's, for Trump, that just means there's more that you have to buy from us. I mean, I know why Canada wants it. So if I was Carney, what I'd say, we can't depend on American pipeline. We should send it through Hudson Bay.
Yeah.
We should build a pipeline from Alberta that doesn't go through First Nations territory, that doesn't go to the Pacific, that goes to Hudson Bay, take advantage of the warming Arctic for ourselves. How many former NDP Green voters are going to be happy about a new pipeline that goes to Hudson Bay? It's an incredibly difficult coalition for him to keep together over 4 years.
Yeah.
And so I think the future's bright for the CPC, actually. Just maybe Carney will prove to be the greatest politician since Pierre Trudeau and keeping together, factions. But I think he's also facing the greatest conservative leader since John Diefenbaker. I think he's better in some ways than Stephen Harper, as much as I love Stephen Harper. And Brian Mulroney basically made a pact with the devil in Quebec to get him his majorities, and that's not going to happen again. So, I just think the problem's going to be, I was asked to comment on the deal, and I think Trump is happy. I think Trump thinks that with most countries, they need the American consumer more than the American consumer needs the goods. And the question is, you could probably wait till the midterms and maybe have an American voter reaction. The question is, can you hold out until the American midterms?
Far be it for me to challenge the star power of Pierre Poilievre, and because I think, Henry, you're right, he's demonstrated that he has been able to build something that no other modern conservative leader has. But I would counter a little bit and suggest to you, let's not assume there's an entire generosity of spirit in the Prime Minister saying recently that Pierre Poilievre can return to the House as soon as he likes, because I think there's a broader section of Canada who may not see the greatness in Pierre Poilievre that you do at the moment, and have challenges with his ability to grow and learn, and whether he will succeed. I think he will welcome the commentary that you have given, as will his caucus, but let's also not assume, and I know you're not, but I'm speaking from most recently coming out of Canada as of this morning, that he will necessarily be the leader in 4 years either. There's a lot that can happen. Right now, he's in strong, he's not being pushed, he's going to have the same potential opportunity that Stephen Harper did, and Stephen Harper used that to great effect, don't get me wrong in all of that, but 2 to 4 years is a long time in the Conservative Party Jamie and I come from. I think I'm still pulling knives out from 20 years ago, so 2 years it'll be landmines and bazookas, but who knows?
Very good. So I had a couple of quick questions on the international side. One, actually from Jonathan's point. I mean, I like what Jonathan said. I like what you said, Jonathan, about the need to work with the U.S., for Canada to work with the U.S. on issues like Russia, China, the Arctic, and so on. But do you think this is really a priority for Carney? I mean, that's sort of question number one. What can we realistically expect? Because he's got such massive challenges apart from those issues. And then the other, back to Henry's point about Trump, I mean, to this day, it's hard to believe that Trump is serious about wanting to annex Canada, and yet he keeps saying, no, I'm serious. People will say, no, you're trolling, you're kidding, right? And he keeps saying over and over again, no, I really mean it. I want to annex. So, obviously a lot of Canadian voters decided to take him at his word. I'm just curious, Henry, if you think he's serious. So maybe start with Jonathan.
Okay, well, you got the easy question, Henry.
Do I think he's serious? Yeah. I mean, but not in terms of a military annexation, this isn't going to be Donald Trump has watched Weird Al Yankovic's Canadian Idiot video and decides to launch a preemptive strike. Watch it. It's a funny 2-minute song. But yeah, I mean, think about what he was saying. Mark Carney says, that some plots of real estate are never for sale, and Donald Trump responds, never say never. I would almost want to troll him and say, well, we can't be one state. We've got to be 11. Do you want to give us 11 new states? Well, then we'll think about it. 22 seats. You just kind of troll him back is what actually I would consider doing. Not necessarily as the prime minister, but as people in his orbit. But yeah, look, the United States faces something that has not been faced since my youth, and that is a geopolitical adversary that is capable of inflicting pain on the United States and threatening our allies. The United States does so in a position where it assumed it was never going to have to face that again, and it has allowed its war-making capacity to deteriorate largely because of globalization. It has allowed social divisions to arise largely because of the twin problems of globalization, which is mass immigration and mass deindustrialization. And Donald Trump opposes that and has always opposed that. And the bottom line is, where does Canada fit into this? If Canada, and so he looks at this and he says, if Justin Trudeau literally says to him on a phone call, as Trump says, that, well, if the tariffs go in, we can't exist as a separate country. That sparks an idea in a 8-year-old man's idea. Well, I guess that means you can't afford to be a separate country. And I think that's literally where it comes from. But America needs a strong position in the Arctic. We don't have territory in the Arctic. Greenland and Canada have territory in the Arctic. We need to have money and rebuild our war-making capacity in places that we can control. And that means, in Trump's mind, the continental United States. I would include Canada as part of that, but that's not where Trump is thinking. And Trump has had a 40-year aversion, documented aversion, to trade deficits. And so the question is, to be serious, if you want to talk about the man in the Oval Office, that's the challenge that you have to deal with, not the old America. And this is, if Canada wants to be part of that, I think Canada would be welcome to be part of that. But it does mean you probably have to give up the wheat control board, and it probably means when you spend 3%.
Supply management.
You're talking about getting to 3% as a minimum. That's doubling your defense budget in like 2 years. But that's what you're. I'm sorry.
Give us a little bit more time in 2 years for free.
But that's my point. Is that literally Denmark went from a social democratic prime minister said we'll get to 2% over 10 years. Then the invasion of Ukraine happens, and they got to 2% last year. Then Vance gave his Munich speech, and she said, we're going to go to 3% this year. Buy anything off the shelf. More is better than quality. We need it now. When you've got Denmark increasing its defense budget by 50% in a year, you've got Belgium increasing their defense budget by 67% in a year. The idea that somehow Canada and Friedrich Merz throwing aside the debt break in Germany to make sure that Germany can afford 2 or 3%. The idea that somehow Canada is exempt from all of this, and maybe we'll get to 2%. No, that's not the way Donald Trump will look at it. He will look at that and say, these people who don't want to sell me Greenland can afford to have their own defense. I threatened to annex Greenland, and they say they're going to spend $1 billion on ships to defend Greenland. All I have to do is threaten it. And they throw $1 billion. What can the Canadians do?
Well,
that's the world you live in. I'm sorry. And it's not the world I want to live in, but it's the world we do live in. And so if you want a quick deal, you have to pay the price. You don't want a quick deal, we're going to see who can hold out longer.
Well, two very quick points, Colin, because I want to get to the audience on this. But I fully take your point and fully agree with you. There is something to be said about the numbers too. You talk, for example, the Greeks talk about spending 4 to 5%, and they've got huge pensions for all their former generals. But that being said, a commitment's a commitment. We need to spend more money. Absolutely, point taken. And to your point, Colin, I think one of the challenges I would love, for example, I mentioned G7 and NATO summit. I see those as ideally opportunities for a country like Canada to be talking about, but especially in the NATO context, we're sort of that one, unfortunately, in recent years, that's been kind of running out of the bill for dinner and sort of hiding in the corner. So it doesn't provide the opportunity in those summits to lead and more to survive. And I think Balkan, we've attended a couple of these summits in recent years too. And the goal is sort of to get out of there and hopefully get out of there alive, because we know that the pressure is coming. One last point, Colin, and I was living in Japan during Trump 1.0 administration, and when the Trump administration pulled out of the TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership. And I think we can learn a lesson from the way the late Abe Shinzo sort of approached setting up which we have now renamed the CPTPP, the best acronym of all time, is that, I didn't have a sort of a mental sort of connect with Shinzo Abe, but basically his sort of theory and thesis behind this was hedging in and waiting for America. So look, the Americans are probably not going to join the TPP anytime soon, but his point was hedging into other democracies. So when we're talking about diversification, we're talking even on the defense side. Look, I agree with you on the F-35s, by the way. I think this is a political discussion. It was ahead of an election, so I think we need to first couch it for a moment right now and take a bit of a breath. But there also are things that can complement on top of the American kit and capabilities we have. So for example, South Korea. Right now, we don't know if they will be successful in one of the large bidding for our submarines, but there are other like-minded democracies that absolutely can complement some of the American materiel and expertise. That is, I think, the move that we have to have economically and in national security terms when we're talking about that diversification, is not just say, okay, let's talk to everyone because we're upset with our relationship with the United States, but say realistically, what are the capabilities that, number one, suit our interest, but at some point, when we may not have the old US back, but you will always be our neighbor, you will always be our partner, and we want those relationships and those capabilities that will complement that relationship in the long run. So I think that's the way that we should be thinking about, in simple terms, Japan, Korea, not China, when we're thinking about the partners that we should be thinking about, at least in that part of the world.
And I would say in terms of the defense spending, I think fundamentally the issue is also the spending part of it. It's not so much finding the money, but getting the money out of the door. Department of National Defense every year, like last year, I don't know, they reach over $4 billion back because they cannot procure and get things out. Our procurement system is Byzantine. 6 agencies get their fingers in. The guys who buy paper clips also has a say in how to buy submarines. And there's always we have to reform it. We have to reform it. Carney also promised to set up a streamlined procurement agency, and I think that would be a great test in terms of whether the current government is serious about making changes. Because fundamentally, a political push. It's somebody, the political leadership, need to cut that particle Gordian knot and basically push it up, right? And our allies did it, as Henry pointed out. Others with the Westminster system streamlined their work. The Danes, I used to teach at the University of Copenhagen, they do have a thing called defense agreement, which the political parties, now they extended to 10 years, it used to be 5 years. The major political parties in the parliament come and agree on the broad outlines and how much is going to be spent. It's not a legally binding document, but in a society that is based heavily on consensus, you cannot really sort of defect without paying a big price on it. And so they can move very fast. And I think that the defense procurement component is going to be a first real test in the sense that whether we are putting our money where our mouth is, and whether it is just rhetoric in terms of, yes, we're going to spend up, we're going to extend our ability and ramp up our capabilities, or is it just we're going to say one thing, but we'll not do other things. So it's revealed preferences versus stated preferences issue.
So we're actually a little bit over time. Let me ask the people who are really in charge. Do we have time for one audience question? We do? Okay. Is there a mic that can be passed around? And hands from anyone who, right here.
Hi, this was a really interesting presentation. I was wondering, in discussion earlier, there was talks about I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the word for a moment, the kind of protectionism on America's side regarding popular culture and such, but Canada famously has the CanCon provisions on both the Broadcasting Act and the Online Streaming Act. Would provisions like that be things that could be up for negotiation, or would that be too harsh of a attack on a fairly smaller pop culture industry? And honestly, can that be afforded to be protected?
Good question.
I would say this, knowing something a colleague of Jamie's and Jonathan told me recently. Yeah, anything can be up for negotiation. I think even when it comes to supply management, which is usually, and Henry references the sacred cow, pardon the obvious oxymoron there. Yes, but very cautiously. I think there's a bit of an evolution in the Canadian cultural landscape and the way we look at how we produce products, but certainly in places like Quebec, where the current government just got a whole dollop of support, that there'd be some caution around that. I think if I remember correctly, Carney has a bit of a different view, doesn't he, on the digital services tax, which is, I'm now starting to pull it out of my, a part of my body I can't say on camera, but possibly, but with caution would be my appropriate answer.
I think for sure that whether or not the Carney has a different stance, the digital service tax is something that definitely is going to be a point of contention. I know it's not in line with your question, but it absolutely 100% unfairly targets American companies for major retroactive taxes that are due for years in advance before the tax even became the law, which it's just completely bonkers. So I wouldn't be surprised if that's one of the first things that they start talking about. And then the CanCon aspect of things might go away. But I have to say, growing up, I think I've heard Nickelback and Alanis Morissette more than I care to because of CanCon.
You hater.
I know. But now that I am a Canadian living in the United States, I specifically subscribe to SiriusXM so that I can listen to Canadian content. So you never know.
Great big C, exactly.
I was about to say, I have bitter memories of growing up in the 1980s, being forced to listen to Corey Hart nonstop on the radio, and I attribute that to the Canadian content laws. I haven't recovered. But this was a great panel. Thank you so much. Please join me in thanking our panelists, everyone.